The ruins of St Andrew's Cathedral dominate the town. Once one of the busiest pilgrimage sites in Europe, St Andrew's, one of the biggest cathedrals in the world, was at the very heart of the Reformation that engulfed the country in the 1500s, with executions, murders, and even a castle siege. I am Jim Leslie, and this is the Year of Stories, and my story today is about the siege of St Andrew's Castle. The Reformation was to sweep away much of the immense wealth and influence that the Catholic Church has held, as it was replaced by a Protestant Presbyterian Church. The change did not come easily. Below the tower of St Salvator's College, these cobbles hold the letters P.H., a reminder of Patrick Hamilton, Scotland's first Protestant martyr. Patrick Hamilton was an influential Catholic churchman who had heard the preachings of Martin Luther and had been inspired by them. He brought this back to Scotland, and he was trying to introduce these changes to the church here. Archbishop James Beaton of St Andrews, he was trying to crush this Reformation movement, and so he invited Hamilton to come to St Andrews for a conference. Hamilton was allowed to preach and to debate for a month before Beaton had him arrested and taken before a church court. He was tried on 13 charges of heresy, speaking out against the church, and found guilty of all charges. His sentence was to be burned at the stake, and the sentence was to be carried out that day to prevent any chance of a rescue attempt. Well, it was a typical St Andrew's Day. It was wet, it was windy. It took 4 attempts to get the fire to start whilst Hamilton is tied to this stake. On the 4th occasion, they used gunpowder to start the flames. The gunpowder flashed up, burning his hands, burning his head, but the fire was still very weak. The fire burned very slowly, and so Hamilton's execution lasted 6 hours. A large crowd had gathered to watch, and inspired by his bravery and by his preaching, many of them went on to follow his teachings. It was said the reek of Master Patrick Hamilton infected all that it blew upon. Hamilton was not, however, the last Protestant martyr, and we're going to go round to St Andrew's Castle now and hear about another of St Andrew's martyrs. In the 1540s, another Protestant reformer, George Wishart, was travelling across Scotland preaching against the papacy. In constant fear of his life, he was accompanied by a sword-wielding bodyguard. This was John Knox, who was to become the figurehead of the Scottish Reformation. In 1546, Wishart is arrested near to Edinburgh, and as he is led away, he tells Knox to flee, saying, "One is enough for one sacrifice." Wishart is brought here to St Andrews, where, like Hamilton before him, he is convicted of heresy and sentenced to burn at the stake. Like Hamilton, cobbles with his initials mark the spot of his execution. Archbishop Beaton, he watches the execution from the tower behind me. Now the people, they liked Wishart, and this brutal execution hardened their hearts. Something had to be done. Well, Norman Leslie of Rothes, he brought a group of his men here to St Andrews, where he was joined by his uncle John Leslie and William Kirkcaldy of Grange with their own men. They were going to seize the castle. At the time, the castle was being modified, being improved, and Norman Leslie and his men dressed as stonemasons. When the drawbridge came down in the morning for the builders to enter, Norman Leslie and his men went in with them. As they assembled in the courtyard, his uncle John Leslie and Kirkcaldy of Grange's men, they approached the drawbridge. Seeing armed men coming, the gatekeeper tried to raise the drawbridge, but he was overpowered. He was stabbed and his body thrown into the ditch. The Leslies then went through the castle, telling servants, telling household staff to leave. The masons, they were sent home. They would not be needed this day. The castle had been taken. No alarm had yet been raised, and Archbishop Beaton was still unaware. The Leslies went to Beaton's room in the tower and banged on the door. Beaton, in fear for his life, refused to open the door until the Leslies threatened to burn it down. Beaton reluctantly opened the door, crying for them to spare him. "You cannot kill me, I am a priest." One of the men, Melville, said to Beaton, "We are not common murderers, we are the tools of God's work," and thrust a sword into Beaton's stomach. Beaton was executed and his body hung from an upper window in the tower behind. The castle was secured and the siege of St Andrews had begun. The castle had been greatly reinforced by Archbishop Beaton, who had built 2 massive towers at each end of the south wall. This was a very difficult place to attack. 5 months into the siege, the Regent of Scotland, Hamilton, acting on behalf of the young Mary Queen of Scots, tried a new tactic. He brought cannon to blast the walls of the castle. Clearly this would have been frightening for the defenders, but they were secure behind these huge, strong walls. By contrast, however, the defenders' artillerymen were able to cause a lot of damage and many wounded and killed attackers on Hamilton's side. In November, Hamilton decided to take a different attack. He decided to build a mine, a tunnel that would come under the castle walls, would be filled with dynamite and blown up to bring down the castle's defences. The defenders were aware, they could hear the work going on. They knew this mine was approaching. They had to build a counter mine, a tunnel of their own to intercept it. Now, whilst the attackers had months to build a huge gallery with stepped stone steps to transport the rubble out of their mine, the defenders had a rushed job, a narrow, dark, airless tunnel. However, they knew this was their only way to save the castle. They first had to find the attackers' mine. They dug 2 shafts either side of the gatehouse and listened for the sound of the approaching attackers. They were in the wrong place. They moved to the other side of Beaton's tower and dug a 3rd shaft. This time they were on target. They intercepted the attackers' mine, broke through and repelled the advance. By this time, Hamilton's men were weakened by illness and he agreed a truce with the defenders. He offered to withdraw his attack whilst they appealed to the Pope for clemency in regard of Beaton's murder. The defenders agreed and an uneasy truce began. People were able to leave the castle for the first time in months. People also arrived to reinforce the defenders, including Wishart's bodyguard, John Knox. Word eventually came from the Pope that he was willing to pardon the defenders, but they did not trust his word. They decided they were going to maintain control of the castle, and the siege was back on. 20 French warships came in support of the Scottish government. They bombarded the castle. However, again, the defenders' gunners were more effective, causing much death and damage to the French fleet. At this time, Hamilton had an Italian gunner set up cannons on St Salvator's Tower above the cobbles marking Patrick Hamilton's execution site, and also the cathedral towers. These cannons bombarded the castle and this time were effective, reducing it to rubble in just 10 hours. The defenders had to concede. They came out. Many of them were sent to work as galley men on French galleys, including John Knox. The time of the archbishops, however, was coming to an end. 13 years after the siege of St Andrews, the Reformation had seen the Catholic Church displaced and the establishment of the Church of Scotland. This was certainly not the end of religious disharmony, however, as my previous video on the National Covenant showed. Today, 500 years later, you can still access the Defender's countermine through these steps ahead, and this will allow you to crawl through this narrow, claustrophobic tunnel to the larger mine built by the attackers.